Hello, everyone. So we are continuing with lecture 2 of lesson 28. So far, we talked about sort of Roman love poetry and how, it represents something about late Republican Rome and how Augustus intervened in that. And now I want to talk a little bit about philosophical schools in Rome in this period. And in general, it's helpful for you to think about two philosophical schools in ancient Rome. A philosophical school would be a group of individuals who sort of identify as part of a wider philosophical movement. These are associated, in the case of the Epicureans, with a Greek philosopher, Epicurus, and in the case of the Stoics, with a place in Athens called the Stoa. So these are the two schools, Epicurean and Stoic, and they are clearly in opposition to each other. But I think it would be a mistake to think that the idea was that some people felt very committed to one or the other. Unless you were a philosopher, that might not have been the case. It might be more helpful to think about these as sort of intellectual ideals available to members of the elite who could read and write in ancient Rome. And so the philosophical school I would like to talk about is the one that's more influential in late Republican Rome, and that is the Epicurean school. And just to have a sort of quick comparison, though, between the two schools, it's helpful to think of the Epicureans as a school that sort of endorses some pleasures. And that would fit very much with what we have been talking about in terms of societal norms and customs. So they would say pursuing some pleasures is okay, but the idea that the Epicureans have is that you want to be free from fear and from pain, and therefore you don't want to get so caught up in your pleasures that you're addicted to them and therefore not free, right? The Stoics, in comparison, advocated that one should be indifferent to pleasure and pain. One should just tolerate both of those without too much hassle. The way we use the word Stoic today is actually not inappropriate as a comparison. In contrast, Epicureans today usually are seen in English parlance as more hedonistic, somebody who's really just pursuing pleasures and that's it. So that's an important distinction. Epicurean is maybe not a good way to describe an ancient Epicurean if you mean it in the sense of the modern English word. So the Epicureans are the ones that matter to us in this context of late Republican Rome. And so Epicurus was a Greek philosopher, and this is just a little bit of background on him, who developed a philosophical set of ideas, the main goal of which was something like happiness, or well-being, maybe is a better translation of eudaimonia, which he thought was a mind free from any kind of disturbance and a body free from pain, right? So you really want to have a chill mind. And how do you get such a mind is that he would argue that fear and ignorance cause disturbances in the mind and the body. And so the way to achieve this freedom, this ataraxia, is by understanding the true nature of things and thereby removing the source of fear and disturbance. The reason this is quite important to us is that one part of Epicurean philosophy argued that, in fact, the traditional interpretation of gods, both in the Greek and the Roman world, was not very helpful in terms of avoiding fear, because many people feared punishment and interference from the gods, right? That was a large part of what motivated a lot of ritual action. And so for the Epicureans, this seemed like quite a superstitious belief, because they suggested that the gods are immortal and blessed, and they are not that invested in passing judgment on individuals. They are not particularly vengeful, and ultimately they don't care about what you are doing in a particular spot in Rome at this particular time. They are more interested in their own divine matters. So importantly, they don't say that there aren't gods. They say there are gods. They just don't care so much about you. But that means you don't have a reason to fear them. Another thing that they thought was also causing fear was death, but that also comes in a bit of a religious context, because quite a few people, they argued, really fear death because they are worried about after death, right? That there might be punishment or some kind of just dreadful existence. But what the Epicureans argued is death is just the end of life. In fact, they had a very sort of elementary atomism, that is, that we are all little particles, that are put together. Fascinating. Without microscopes, they came up with the idea. And they said that the death is separation of the body and soul, and we only would have sensations if we had a body. And if our body, upon death, dissolves into its material components, and the soul will be separated, then there is really no way that you could be experiencing any of the things these people are worried about. You're not going to be suffering in death because you'll be dead and come apart, in all your atoms. And the best way to know what the Romans actually thought about all this Epicurean philosophy, which again was written in Greek hundreds of years earlier, is that exactly in this period, a contemporary of Catullus by the name of Lucretius, a Latin poet, wrote a work that's really fascinating, called On the Nature of On the Nature of Things, and just sort of meant to explain the world, if you wish. And this is what Cicero had to say about this, just in case you want to get a sense of a contemporary perspective. The poems of Lucretius are, as you write, they exhibit many flashes of genius and yet show great mastership, right? So it's a pretty good poem. And the idea was that he dedicated this work to a patron and friend in order to free him from fears of the supernatural, that is the gods, and of death on these Epicurean grounds. But it was also a beautiful way to develop Latin poetic language to describe Epicurean philosophy. And people often think about it that he put this into poetry because he tried to sweeten the sophisticated or bitter medicine of philosophical knowledge for his audience. And Virgil himself referred to Lucretius as a happy person, he who has discovered the causes of things and has cast beneath his feet all fears, and the din of the devouring underworld. So the reason I wanted to mention Lucretius and generally Epicurean philosophy, because I think it shows us something about the intellectual movements happening in Rome in this period, and suggests that quite a few people were challenging traditional ways of thinking. And that included also a challenge to traditional religion, because if you're not going to be so afraid of the gods punishing you, you might choose not to participate in some religious rituals, or at least be skeptical about, okay, should we really be counting those birds before we go into a battle? So the idea is that there was quite a bit of an intellectual revolution at this time in Rome. And you are probably not surprised to hear, though, that Augustus was not really buying this, that he was invested in something different, or he didn't want people to be skeptical of religion. You might recall his roles in priesthood. He's claimed that Apollo was a supporter of him. We see Augustus really wanting to endorse Rome's traditional religion and claim that he returned to that tradition rather than suggest that we should move away from superstitious ideas in the Epicurean vein. So when we come back for lecture 3, I would like to spend some time and read Virgil's Aeneid, a few sections of that are also available on PDF to you, in this context of thinking about some of the ideas about a good life, some of the ideas about love, some of the ideas about Rome and Augustus himself, in order to try to understand how that might have looked to someone who lived in that period.